Okay, so welcome everyone. I hope everyone can hear me. Jeff, can you hear me?
Yes.
Wonder,
yes.
Many book events by now, but this is going to be by far the best. First because of all of you. I want to thank the speakers. I'm going to thank them also at the end later, but I want to thank everyone for contributing such thoughtful responses and comments on Professor Karayanni's book. And also, this is the first in-person gathering to celebrate your book, right? So, so in a sense, that's, and I think, I mean, am I wrong to assume that this is also the first Jerusalem Review of Legal Studies Symposium to be held on campus since the beginning of the pandemic? I think it is, right? So in a sense, I mean, we are here to discuss Professor Karayanni's new book on law and religion and the multicultural entrapment, but we're also celebrating, in a sense, some kind of back to normalcy, having a real conference on campus with food. And our only regret is that Professor Jeff Spinner-Halev couldn't join us today, sadly. I mean, we both, Jeff and us, really wanted and tried to make it happen, but this is a reminder that things aren't just normal in our world yet, unfortunately. But we owe Jeff a visit, and we'll make up for this, Jeff. So, okay, so I don't want to take too much time. We have a busy schedule. So I just want to, again, thank you all for coming and present just briefly our speakers and what we're going to do this evening here. So as I said, we're discussing Professor Karayanni's new book, Multicultural Entrapment, Law and Religion and the Palestinian-Arab minority in Israel. And this is a very multifaceted book, and we have summoned here a very interesting and diverse group of scholars to discuss it. We'll begin with Professor Rawia Aburabia. This is the second time where my English is failing me tonight. From Sapir, who will both present the book and discuss it. So Rawia will speak for 30 minutes because she has the complicated job of both giving us a summary of the book and then providing comment on it. And then we'll hear from several additional speakers who will discuss the book from various perspectives, critically and from more international perspectives and from more local perspectives, from perspectives of minority and majority relations. And we're going to introduce to you from North Carolina, Chapel Hill. He's joining us today, and we're very, very grateful to be hearing from him. Jeff is a renowned scholar of multiculturalism, and I can't wait to hear you talk about Michael's book this evening. And then we'll hear from Professor Amihai Radzyner. I hope I'm getting the schedule right, but you can always correct me if I'm wrong, from Bar-Ilan University.
I'm the last.
Okay, you were just promoted. Who will talk about, we'll comment from the perspective of family law and the intricate relations that also relate to Jewish courts in Israel. And we'll hear from Professor Raef Zreik. There you are.
Who also promoted me to a professor.
Everyone are professors. This is American conference, and we're talking about professor as a mission rather than as a title. So this is an academic mission. Professor Zreik will talk about the perspective, also from an historical perspective, about the relations between the Jewish majority and the Arab Palestinian minority. And we'll hear from Professor Danny Statman. You haven't been promoted by me just now. You have been and you will be. The Dean of Philosophy at
now, yeah.
I'm just following on your conversation with
Now you promoted philosophy.
in the University of Haifa. Everyone gets something from just coming. And this will also be a different perspective, another enriching perspective in Michael's book. So we have a busy schedule today. We're gonna do several presentations, then take a short break, come back for additional 2 presentations. And then finally, we'll hear from Professor Karayanni. maybe I'll, yeah. So, who will have the very challenging task of responding to everyone. But I'm counting on you to do that. And then we'll conclude, and I hope that everyone will have an joyful symposium. So, without further ado,
okay, so good afternoon, or good evening, everyone, and thank you, Netta, for this invitation. Today's scholarly debate on state and religion in Israel has been Jewish-oriented, focusing on the major tensions and clashes between the state and the Jewish religion. Palestinian-Arab religious matters have been treated as peripheral and private matter of religious groups. This gap in the literature reflects the power structure of the Jewish state and its discriminatory treatment of the Palestinian-Arab minority. Michael Karayanni's book, In Multicultural Entrapment, Religion and State Among the Palestinian Arabs in Israel, is a thorough and provocative attempt to unmask the false nature of multicultural accommodation of the religious jurisdiction of Palestinian Arabs. Karayanni provides a rich, comprehensive analysis of multicultural theory, its scope, historical development, limitation, and its implementation in the case of the Palestinian minority in Israel. It brings to the forefront the main challenges of multicultural theory by focusing on the judicial religious jurisdiction of the Palestinian Arab minority in personal status laws. He touches upon one of the most important scholarly debates of multicultural theory and dilemmas of the minority within a minority group, providing us with a rich and comprehensive account of the challenges of multicultural accommodation of minority groups and the application of harmful patriarchal norms toward marginal excluded groups such as women and children. Karayanni's account of multiculturalism is a critical analysis that strengthens the connection between Israel's Jewish character and its multicultural ramifications. It exposes the hidden side of multiculturalism as a form of oppression and the facade of liberal multicultural accommodation of the Palestinian Arab religious jurisdiction. The book is organized thematically around 6 chapters. Each chapter shed lights on a different aspect of the multicultural accommodation of the religious jurisdiction of the Palestinian Arabs minority. Karayanni gradually exposed the cracks and the flaws of multicultural theory and practice and its application in the Israeli context that significantly differ from another liberal democratic context. Karayanni gradually lead us in each chapter toward his major thesis in chapter 5, which will be the focus of my short comment, where he innovatively coins the term multicultural entrapment to unmask the nature of multiculturalism in Israel. This book departs from intellectually situating Palestinian Arab religious matters as part of the state-religion conflict. This is a necessary step Karayanni takes to include Palestinian Arab religious matters as part of the ongoing scholarly debate of the state-religion conflict, which to date has been mainly Jewish-oriented. Chapter 1 not only reframes state-religion debate in a new inclusionary perspective, but it also provides us with rich empirical support of Supreme Court cases that vividly shows how liberal Palestinian individuals have challenged the religious patriarchal norms on several occasions. However, these cases were left outside Israel's liberal sphere of state-religion discourse, reflecting its limits and its missing potential when it comes to non-Jewish groups. This important chapter is the starting point of Karayanni's sharp account of his broken dream of multiculturalism. Chapter 2 is one of the most important chapters of this book, where Karayanni brilliantly offers us a new reading of the public-private spheres in Israel and explains the reason for excluding Palestinian religious matters from public sphere. Traditionally, civil society has been divided into the public and private spheres, with women and the family exclusively occupying the private sphere. The control and subjugation of women are fundamental to the social order. It is important to consider the family when addressing the different level of political organization and power. A sizable portion of the cultural inhibitions that women face and the inequality of women stem from and flourishes in the privacy of the household. For the most part, the private sphere is where culture is preserved, lived, and transmitted to the next generation. Cultural practices involving the oppression of women can be hidden in private and constructed as familial matters that merit public interest or state intervention only in exceptional situations. The distinction between the private and the public, therefore, plays a central role in the delineation of the boundaries of citizenship. This distinction determines the degree to which the state allows itself to intervene in the private sphere. Karayanni invites us to consider the Israeli public sphere as Jewish, giving the state national character and the construction of Judaism as the official national religion of the state. He shows us how this situation creates a dissonance in religious course positionality vis-a-vis the Jewish state. According to his innovative reading of spheres, rabbinical jurisdiction is included as part of the Jewish public sphere, and as such is perceived as illiberal toward its individuals, while their Palestinian counterparts are considered part of the state private sphere, and thus the recognition is preserved as multicultural and as part of minority accommodation. Karayanni's insights clearly demonstrate how granting autonomy to religious courts and family law matters creates fertile ground for preserving discriminatory patriarchal norms of minority group under the guise of multiculturalism and deprives them of state intervention. This chapter adds an important dimension to our understanding of the public-private dynamic of state-religion conflict and includes Palestinian religious matter as part of it. In chapter 3 and 4, Karayanni diagnoses the religious authority of Palestinians as individual predicament and analyzes its acute nature. These chapters have significant scholarly and normative contributions to the literature of the minority within a minority in what Karayanni defines in chapter 3 as the individual predicament, which is the price paid by internal minorities, such women and children, for the state multicultural accommodation that grants recognition and autonomy to oppressive patriarchal religious norms and institutions. After Karayanni defines and characterizes the nature of this individual predicament in chapter 3, he expands the discussion in chapter 4 by addressing the acute nature in the case of the Palestinian-Arab. He provides us with two explanations to the severity of the individual predicament in Israel in comparison to Western democracies. First, the definition of the state as Jewish exclude Palestinians, hinder multiculturalism, and construct Palestinian-Arabs in religious terms rather than national ones. Second, secular and religious forces of the Palestinian community preserve the granted religious jurisdiction as part of the imagined autonomy, regardless of its oppressive nature, and thus they do not feel compelled to challenge it. A central theme advanced by Karayanni in chapter 5 is the multicultural entrapment thesis, in which he exposes the multicultural false nature of the jurisdictional authority granted to the Palestinian-Arabs. I will expand more on this later. Finally, after this fascinating scholarly journey, in chapter 6, Karayanni, not satisfied with his great intellectual contribution, envisions normative insights and tools that will relieve multicultural entrapment and enable internal minorities to exit their communities. These include criminalizing oppressive religious practices, establishing an independent and secular system for marriage and divorce for Palestinian Arabs based on the experience of Middle Eastern countries, and what he calls feeble measures, changing from within religious practices. This book fits with Karayanni's career trajectory as one of the leading scholars of multiculturalism and reflects the intellectual journey of his work on multiculturalism. His work is based on the rich scholarly writing on multiculturalism and Palestinian Arab communities in Israel, and reflects his 2 decades of scholarly work on multiculturalism. His first groundbreaking article on multiculturalism diagnosed the major challenges of multiculturalism in Israel. As his work progressed, he pointed out the cracks and flaws of multicultural theory in the case of Palestinian Arabs in his articles. He creatively employed Virginia's Woolf metaphor of the private space in a room of her own to problematize the public-private divide by exposing the true nature of the Israeli public sphere and the Palestinian private sphere. He gradually and skillfully identified the facade nature of multicultural theory. Finally, he coined the term multicultural entrapment in this book. This is the highlight of Karayanni's intellectual journey. It is capturing the true scope and the devious nature of multiculturalism and its application in the Israeli case. But it doesn't give up multiculturalism as the desired framework. The focus of my short comment is chapter 5, entitled The Individual Predicament as Multicultural Entrapment. In this chapter, I will present Karayanni's main arguments and critically address the colonial dimension of multicultural entrapment. Karayanni argues that the religious jurisdiction of Palestinian minority, as it manifested in an individual predicament, is a multicultural entrapment. He reveals the deceptive character of multiculturalism, arguing that a central component of it is the pseudo-recognition of the religious jurisdiction authority of the Palestinian community as a multicultural accommodation. This false recognition imprisoned Palestinian individuals within the religious identities and communities. Karayanni, interestingly, exposes how this imprisonment is the self-interest of the Palestinian minority as well, arguing that the hidden agenda of the multicultural facade is to control the Palestinian minority and to strengthen the Jewish character of the State of Israel. What is interesting about this claim is its duplicate nature, as it indicated the way multicultural forces work within the Palestinian community and towards the state. Karayanni's contribution is his exposure of the multiple layers of multicultural entrapment that eventually promote the same goals of the state and the minority conservative anti-secular agenda, which is rather oppressive toward the minority within a minority. This is quite overwhelming since multiculturalism in its essence strives to implement liberal values. However, in the name of those very same multicultural values, the suggested accommodation ends up advancing oppressive practices that, because they serve the same interest, they manage to exist. Karayanni touches upon what he refers to as multicultural qualifications, a set of criteria that enable us to determine whether a certain group is entitled to multicultural accommodation. He provides us with a comprehensive historical account of the development of liberal thought concerning group rights, from religious tolerance to minority group rights to liberal multiculturalism. Two important key points of the multicultural philosophy mentioned in his account are the inclusion and recognition of minority group rights as a tool to prevent oppression. A crucial emphasis relevant to the Palestinian-Arab case is the distinction between immigrants and indigenous minorities in regards to multicultural accommodation. In the case of the indigenous community, the state should accommodate itself to the minority, giving their pre-existence to the state, while in the case of the immigrants, it is expected that they will adjust themselves to the state. Despite this, his comprehensive account of multiculturalism and the criteria of multicultural accommodation, though Karayanni is very critical of the multicultural theory and recognizes its limit, he doesn't abandon it. Furthermore, he offers 4 additional fundamental criteria to compensate for the flaws of multicultural accommodation. Minority rights should reflect compensation element for the dominance of the majority. Culture should be holistically defined, accommodating the group according to the will of its members, and finally accommodating the group in a way that will guarantee their interests in the best way. Karayanni's account reflects his broken dream of multiculturalism. He unmasks multiculturalism as it manifests itself in Israel and recognizes its seductive nature without giving up its normative principles as a theory of justice, diversity, cultural and identity recognition. This theory enables the minority to be heard, seen, and to be an integral part of society. I'm quoting, "The characterization of a group accommodation as multicultural," Karayanni tells us, "can work wonders. It can turn a group mechanisms that is repressive into an ideal that the society wants to preserve, but this only the impression. The working of the covering effect now Karayanni relates these principles to the case of the Palestinian-Arab religious jurisdiction. These questions lies at the heart of Karayanni's analysis and argument throughout the book. As a leading scholar of multiculturalism, his critique reflects an ambivalent stance toward multiculturalism as normative liberal theory, which on one hand has the potential, I'm quoting, to sustain group identity by different measures, and on the other hand, the actual situation in which religious jurisdiction among the Palestinian-Arab cannot possibly qualify as multicultural accommodation. According to Karayanni, the missed potential of multiculturalism is directly connected to the characterization of the State of Israel as a Jewish state that dominates and subordinates the Palestinian minority. He mentioned endogamy and non-assimilative policy toward non-Jewish religious minority as part of the factors that hinder the possibility for multicultural accommodation of religious jurisdiction among the Palestinian-Arabs and mark the national boundaries between Arabs and Jews. Karayanni's main critique of multiculturalism is its deceptive character, that it pretends to be multicultural despite its non-multicultural nature. As part of his critique of the facade of religious jurisdiction among the Palestinian Arabs as a form of multicultural accommodation, he mentioned the structural dimension of the State of Israel as a Jewish and its true interest behind maintaining religious and ethnic divides. He identified the exclusive jurisdiction on matters of marriage and divorce among the religious communities in Israel as part of the national effort of the State of Israel to prevent intermarriage and secure endogamy. Based on the ongoing scholarly debate, Karayanni asked whether the State of Israel could be considered democratic, given its extended occupation of the West Bank and Gaza Strip, but he leaves the question open. I'm quoting, "History will have much to say about this." In my view, this is a crucial dimension that contributes to the classification of the situation of Israel as a settler colonial. Despite this enormous contribution to the scholarly literature of multiculturalism, I wish to push Karayanni's argument further and ask whether we can critically discuss multiculturalism in Israel without addressing the colonial structure of the State of Israel that worsened the multicultural entrapment. Multicultural theory's main goal is to address the challenges of minority groups, providing them with the relevant accommodations that will enable them to be an integral part of society despite the differences between the groups. I argue that to better understand multicultural entrapment, we need to realize the coloniality of the State of Israel. Settler colonialism is not a single event. It is a structure. Thus, it is not merely a state religious conflict. Rather, it is part of the ethnic privileges granted to the Jews in this settler state. This colonial situation affects citizenship, nationality, religion, and religious court and family law. It defines and the delicate dynamic between the Palestinian citizens and the state institution, including its religious court system. Settler colonialism as a scholarly body is not unique to the Israeli context. It explores the common situation of indigenous people around the world, but especially in Australia, Canada, the United States. It rests on the notion that explores the shared experience of the indigenous people, both in history and contemporary present. Settler colonialism as a theoretical framework enables us to analyze how structural colonial mechanisms are working both historically and contemporarily in the structuring of gender, sexual relation, race, and in this context, religious family law and courts. Settler colonialism is based on the premise of displacing or replacing the indigenous on their land by elimination. Patrick Wolf has defined settler colonialism as an invasion that is part of an ongoing structure and not an event. According to this logic, the colonizers come to stay. Settler colonialism differs from colonialism. While the main objective of colonialism is to exploit the resources of the colonies to the advantage of the metropole, settler colonialism main purpose addressing, according to Veracini, is to acquire land and gain control over resources to, I'm quoting, transform the new colony into their home. The objectives of settler colonialism were achieved through political, legal, cultural, and social institutions accompanied by a constant tension between the settlers' desires for indigenizing and the duplication of a European civilized way of life. This tension is rarely to be resolved. Indeed, the Israeli-Palestinian case has been defined by scholars as a settler colonial case. Veracini argues that Zionism as a settler colonial project met the criteria of both colonialism and settler colonialism. Its colonial nature is characterized by the duplication of the European society in a colonial domain by activating political and economic control over the indigenous population. The settler colonial dimension entails disposition of indigenous by the settlers, followed by multicultural inclusion. Barak-Corren's work joins the scholarly work of Kimmerling and Shafil, who have addressed the colonial dimension of Zionism. In addition, Rouhana and Sabah Khouri have characterized Israel's relationship with its Palestinian citizen as settler colonial control case that can be identified as settler colonial citizenship. Iftachel has also defined Israel as a pure settlement colonial society where the colonizers recreated a European-wide society in a new geographical setting, a process that often entailed systematic dispossession and exclusion of indigenous groups. Indeed, Karayanni casts doubt about the democratic nature of the State of Israel on several occasions, but he doesn't give up the multicultural paradigm as a normative theory. I'm quoting, democracy is imperiled when citizens are prevented from marrying or adopting across religious lines in the service of buttressing the national identity character of the state, in which some are included and others are excluded. Another example of the paradox of pseudo-multiculturalism is that it creates a distinctive form of citizenship. Under the guise of multiculturalism, the state hides its non-democratic nature and its oppressive, divided ethnic and religious policies. Thus, it allows the state the luxury of liberal democracy without applying the necessary inclusionary steps vis-a-vis minority groups. Karayanni's thorough critique is also targeted toward the Palestinian minority itself, whereby he systematically and bravely dismantles the dilemmas of the Palestinian political establishment and their complicated positionality vis-a-vis the Jewish state. He reveals the gap between the desired liberal vision of the Palestinian political leadership and their acute acceptance of the patriarchal authority of the religious courts. This gap is explained as a silence in consent that grants a degree of autonomy to the minority. This account demonstrates not only the Palestinian cry for autonomy, but also a sense of collective recognition, however imaginary it might be. I would argue that this limited autonomy is part of the state colonial control of the minority, which is achieved through the Sharia court. In this regard, Shachal suggests we examine proceedings in the Sharia court in Israel as a quasi-colonial reality that operates simultaneously as a site of state intervention control and site of agency, autonomy, and opposition. An additional important dimension of the false nature of multiculturalism, according to Karayanni, has to do with the ways culture is represented. Karayanni points out the Orientalist nature of multicultural accommodation in the case of the religious jurisdiction of the Palestinian-Arabs in Israel, whereby the minority culture is perceived and constructed as backward and unchangeable in comparison to the enlightened West and part of the ethnic construction of minorities in the Middle East that preserved religion and culture as one. This account supports the colonial claim. This sophisticated reading of Karayanni's multicultural Israeli reality is sober-eyed and very much needed. It fills the gap in the scholarly literature of multiculturalism and takes it beyond the safe, neutral debate of religion and state. It demonstrates how multiculturalism and multicultural accommodation manifest themselves in a different political context, but above all, it sharply demonstrates how, as part of a minority group, we may grasp cultural accommodation of minorities as part of state tolerance, when in fact it possesses a non-tolerant and oppressive attitude. Karayanni has shown us how the manipulative nature of multicultural entrapment works and the forces behind it. I would like to add another dimension to his account and suggesting the public sphere as a sphere of settler and the private sphere as a sphere of indigenous. As part of this division, differentiated citizenship that is mentioned in the book will be treated as what Jabarin called colonial citizenship, or what Rouhana and Sabah Khouri called settler colonial citizenship. And according to this logic, the citizenship of the Palestinian in Israel was created under colonial condition. Thus, the policies concerning them were designed in line with their colonial citizenship and were an integral part of it. These conditions become fertile ground for the current multicultural entrapment and its manifestation in the religious jurisdiction of the Palestinian-Arab minority. This is also in line with the formation of family law in colonial and post-colonial his rights and autonomy. As in other post-colonial states, the family played a crucial role in building the Jewish rather on egalitarian citizenship. The British colonial legacy is therefore embedded in Israeli institution and its family law system. Religious courts and family law played a significant role in the colonial structure, while from a multicultural perspective, religious-based family law is perceived as part of groups' rights. They are part of colonial projects, and the cultural perception toward the indigenous community is part of the colonial subject-power relation. In this regard, colonial policies concerning family law and the private sphere were designed according to the colonial logic of maintaining the effective rule. Thus, intervention or non-intervention in the private sphere should be analyzed in line with colonial interests. I argue that Karayanni's provocative critique of multiculturalism and his exposure of its false nature support the claim that Israel is a settler colonial state and that the non-egalitarian nature of family law is a mirror image of the colonial structure. The problem is not just about this false nature, but rather it's about the colonial nature of the state of Israel that worsens the multicultural entrapment and produces additional entrapment, such as the feminational entrapment of Muslim women. I argue that while this book does an impressive job of exposing the true nature of multicultural accommodation of religious jurisdiction, the gendered aspects is missing in this book. The examples provided show the way that multicultural entrapments affect women and further entrap them. However, I think that given the nature of Karayanni's argument and the ways multicultural entrapments subordinate women as a minority within a minority, the book would have benefited from a chapter dedicated to the theoretical gendered aspect of multiculturalism, such as the intersectional theory, that would provide a feminist account to the overlapping mechanism of discrimination and oppression faced by women from minority groups. Karayanni deals with this missing aspect by providing rich examples of the oppressive nature of multicultural accommodation toward women. One of the examples provided in chapter 5 is Palestinian feminism and how it impacts Palestinian women's positionality vis-a-vis the Palestinian cause and the feminist movement. Karayanni argues that despite characterizing the Palestinian community as patriarchal, the preservation of religious jurisdiction among the Palestinians cannot be preserved as an inherent part of Palestinian culture and their identity as a community. Such perception is orientalist in its nature and missing the point. I would further support Karayanni's account by using the case of polygamy among the Palestinian Bedouins in Israel, where 18% of Bedouin households' marriages in the Negev, in the Nakab, are polygamous. Despite the criminalization of polygamy, it is not enforced by the state. Activist feminist Palestinian organization called on the Ministry of Justice Internal Ministerial Task Force on polygamy to uncompromisingly fight it and grant legal protection for Bedouin women. Despite these calls, the task force adopted the most conservative version of Islamic law, recommending the expansion of Sharia courts' authority to permit polygamous marriages in several cases. These recommendations exemplify the ways Bedouin women are subordinated by the state and Sharia court and reflect the state Muslim religious leadership shared interests, which echoes the Orientalist perceptions that Karayanni referred to, which construct Bedouin women as passive, monolithic women, that polygamy is an inherent part of their culture and they lack any ability to resist or exit it. I want to conclude. The greatest success of this book is exposing the true nature of multicultural accommodation of religious jurisdiction of Palestinian-Arab in Israel. Karayanni not only points to the broken dream of multiculturalism, but he leads us with great passion and hope to the post-multicultural moment. How will this moment look? Secular, religiously tolerant, or perhaps post-colonial? The readers will enjoy reading this book and envision the post-multicultural moment. But the first step of removing the multicultural facade was essential, and this has been successfully accomplished by Michael Karayanni in this wonderful, innovative book. Thank you, and Mabruk.
So we're gonna do discussion afterwards. For now, we're proceeding with a presentation, and Professor Spinner-Halev, you're next. So we can see you very well here, and I'm sure at home as well.
So it's not just that I'm sorry I can't be there. It's just that I'm jealous that you're all sitting in a room with so many other people in such a normal way that it's, you know, I'm just jealous that I can't be part of that in person. But perhaps some other time. So reading Michael's powerful and important book really made it clear to me in a way that I didn't really understand how religious family law is often used as a form of control and power. And I will return to that. But I do want to I'm going to talk about two different things today. One, briefly, I'm going to give a small partial defense of liberalism. And then I'm really going to focus on the relationship between multiculturalism and religion. This is an article that I never wrote, but always thought I should, because I think in the literature, multiculturalism, it's just never been clear. And so Michael's book gave me a chance to rethink it. I think there's a lot more to think through. There's also an issue which I might touch upon if I have time. I might not, about the purpose of multiculturalism, which it really is supposed to be a theory of recognition and perhaps of freedom. And I think the question which the previous speaker, I think, brings up also, as well as Michael's book, is is that possible in a context like Israel when there's such power differences between the majority and minority communities? In other words, I guess the question is, when the power differences get to be so large, can multiculturalism be any of any help, or does there have to be a constraint on the power differences? Let me just briefly talk about liberalism. And Michael has in the book, I think, an important distinction between the public discussions of family law in Israel and in the scholarly literature, at least that I'm aware of, and what's private. And I think it's, it seems to me pretty clearly true that much of the discussion of this family law centers around Jewish law in Israel, and not laws that affect the Palestinian-Arab community in Israel. So I'm not disputing the perception at all. I do think that just because people perceive it as private doesn't necessarily make it liberal. And that's the brief point that I want to make, which is one principle of liberalism is something of a liberal neutrality. Of course, that's never completely, that can never be completely granted. But what it does mean to some large degree is that liberal citizens should never be pushed into a particular religion. Liberal citizens, I think, on almost every construal of liberalism, ought to be able to choose their religion and whether they want to stay in the religious community, and ought not to be forced to get married within a religious community's confines. I don't think there's many versions of liberalism, or any versions of liberalism, that would dispute that. So I think the power of Michael's book is to try and hopefully succeed in making the issue of religious family law in the Palestinian Arab community more of a public matter. I think that's the power of the book. or one of the powers of the book, not the only thing, and that it ought to be certainly more discussed, and that it ought to be seen as a violation of liberalism, of democracy, of equality, of liberty. I mean, there's a long list of things I think that it violates, and I think there's a political there are political reasons why that haven't happened, but I don't think liberalism lacks the resources to call upon the change in religious family law in Israel, certainly for the Palestinian-Arab community, but also for the Jewish community as well. I won't get into that, as that's been, as Michael suggests, very, very widely noted. So let me now move to multiculturalism. And I have to say that I am at a deficit to some degree because I don't read Hebrew or Arabic. And so to the extent that Michael is drawing on sources in languages that I can't read, I can't read. And so I'm obviously more familiar with the English-speaking literature. And so there may be ways in which multiculturalism is misused in the Hebrew-speaking literature, and hopefully Michael's book can correct that. So I think Michael makes at least two different arguments about multiculturalism. There's probably a lot more. On the one hand, Karayanni argues that multiculturalism is readily used to give cover to Israeli family law. The cover of multiculturalism, he says, enables the state to hide the reality of oppression, fragmentation, and civic division that exists with and around religious jurisdiction. I think if to the extent that's true, that's wrong. What I take that to mean is that multiculturalism is being misused in these cases. It's giving cover, but it shouldn't be, right? And I think that's probably right. So on the other hand, Karayanni argues that multiculturalism cannot justify the personal law systems in Israel. So on the one hand, it gives cover. On the other hand, it cannot justify the personal law systems. And I agree with that latter one. I agree that to the extent that these laws are used to entrap Palestinian-Arabs in Israel, it is a mistake. I'm not convinced it's multicultural entrapment. It is entrapment. It's entrapment for various reasons that the Israeli state has decided, which Michael talks about in the book. State with advantage. It's a use of control. It seems that it's largely a use of control. But with the exception of Ayelet Shachar, I don't think most multicultural theorists in the English literature that I read would think that multiculturalism should be used as a way to justify religious family law in Israel. As Karayanni points out, there are several forces pushing for Israeli family religious law: Orthodox rabbis, the views of religious and Christian clergy, a desire to control the Palestinian Arab population, and perhaps even inertia in accepting the old Ottoman system without too much critical reflection. But I want to use the arguments of Karayanni, which I think sometimes are critical of multiculturalism, perhaps incorrectly, and sometimes say multiculturalism is wrongly used as a cover, and that's an argument that I certainly would agree with. And I want to say that I think part of the difficulty here is that in the larger literature on multiculturalism, there is a confusion about the relationship between religion and multiculturalism. And of course, it's not Michael's job to entangle that. But I think the confusion in the general literature is sometimes reflected in this. I am not exempting myself from this confusion. In my 2001 ethics piece, multiculturalism is in the title of the piece. And looking back on it, I would say I actually don't remember how that happened. Because I would prefer not to, but it was obviously the word in the air. And so to the extent that there's a confusion, and to the extent that I think there's a confusion there, I'm not exempting myself at all. In fact, I'm partly guilty of this. I don't want to talk too much about my piece. I am certainly grateful for Michael's gracious comments about the piece in the book, so that was really gratifying to read. But I really think that, and I'll just talk briefly. So I'll just go back to Will Kilmaker's arguments, where he talks about, he eventually divides the world into two groups: national groups, and then what he calls polyethnic groups. And there's a question about where do Palestinian Arabs fit in this scheme? Which group are, and if we think of them as Palestinian Arab groups, or a Palestinian Arab group, they would be a national minority. But when we turn to family law, we're clearly thinking about religious groups. And I won't go through my discussion. And Michael, in some ways, agrees with my comments here. Kilmaker has this notion of societal culture, and it's a question about whether that fits Palestinian Arabs or not. Michael questions that. I agree with that. It certainly doesn't fit Palestinian Arabs if we divide them into the different religious groups, the different Christian groups, and Muslim. It might fit Palestinian Arabs when we think of them as a national minority. So the problem here is that Kilmaker, he sometimes includes religious groups in the latter category of what he calls polyethnic groups, and he sometimes does not include religious groups. They weave in and out. I won't go through it. This is also true of Alan Patton's recent book on equal recognition, which is another attempt, a more recent attempt to restate multiculturalism theory. And there's a way in which the relationship between religious groups and multiculturalism is unclear. And it's easier, I think, the relationship to describe when we talk about national groups in a way. National groups that are what Kilmaker calls societal cultures. And here, of course, he's thinking of the Quebecois in Canada as the paradigm group, a group that is mostly geographically concentrated and speak a different language. And in that context, it's not hard to say liberalism can just apply to them. It becomes much harder when we think about religious groups. This is true of religious groups in the Palestinian Arab community. This is true of the Muslims in India, which I also touch upon in my ethics piece. This is true of indigenous peoples in the United States, because many of these religious groups, like many religious groups generally, have patriarchal laws and patriarchal rules and patriarchal systems. So I think that one of the issues and one of the questions is, what is the role of religion in multiculturalism? And I am tempted to say that we should, this is a tentative suggestion, that we should just think of them separately and not think of religion in the rubric of multiculturalism. The word multiculturalism suggests culture, which can coincide with religion, but it doesn't necessarily have to. It's not inherently part of culture. The two obviously overlap. But I think that one of the things that Michael points out so well in his book is that so many religions, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, to some large degree, have patriarchal structures that really run contrary to liberalism. And so I'm tempted to think that we need to disentangle them in an important way, and that doing so would really help us understand better what is at stake and how we might change things. In other words, multiculturalism might just confuse things more when we think about religion. And one of the things when we think about Palestinian Arabs is that they don't fit in Israel. They don't fit the categories of Wilkin-Muka. They don't fit the categories of Alan Patton. And so this is, I think, one of the reasons why I'm making this suggestion. So I actually, so I think that one of the parts of the book I enjoyed the entire book. It was a great read, although I did read it in the beginning of May when the semester here ended. So it was a very depressing moment in Israeli history.
Oh, wait.
But I do think
Jeff, we lost you for a second.
Okay.
Can you repeat your last?
Yeah, so I started reading the book at the beginning of May when our semester ended, and it was a very depressing moment to read the book with all the violence in Israel and the violence between Hamas and Israel, and I'm reading Michael's book, and it was actually really hard at times to read. It would have been hard to read, I think, under normal times. It was particularly hard to read when I was reading the paper, and then turning to Michael's book. But I think, what I appreciate a lot about Michael's book is when he focuses on power and oppression. And so even if we recognize, like I think we ought to, that multiculturalism in its best forms does not justify the personal law systems of Israel, we are still left with the core problem of an oppressed group with oppressive internal rules that are sanctioned by the state. And to me, this is the core problem, which is the legitimacy of the state in India, in Israel, in America, when the minority looks on the state skeptically in terms of its laws and rules. What is the role of the state in undoing some of the group's internal oppressive laws? I'm not going to say much about how I wrestled with the problem, but I would like to hear more from Michael about how you want to wrestle with that problem. And obviously we're in this potentially new historical moment. I don't know if we really are, with a Arab political party part of the coalition, although I do not think this particularly Arab party is going to lead the way toward reforming religious family law in Israel, but perhaps, so what I want to turn to is the issue of politics and power. And here there may be somewhat of a disciplinary difference, whereas Michael is focusing on legal changes. But I really think that even to talk about legal changes, we do need the background of the politics and of the issues of power and legitimacy. I do want to say, though, just sticking to law, that if we're just going to use the framework of law, why not? And I agree with much of Michael's suggestions at the end of the book, where he suggests various ways to alleviate the hold of religious family law on Palestinian Arabs. But I wonder why Michael didn't make the one obvious liberal solution, which is that all citizens ought to have the option of civil marriage, and the option of civil marriage in Israel, not just in Cyprus. And I know he mentions it very quickly on page 261. It passes by quickly because it's a suggestion that he does not think many Palestinian Arabs would take, which I'm not disputing. But nonetheless, if liberal theory insists upon it, it still might be theoretically a good thing to do. But more importantly, it might over time put pressure on religious leaders. In other words, just the threat of exit, this goes back to Alan Hirschman's classic argument about exit's voice and loyalty, but the very threat of exit can over time put pressure on a community's leaders to be more responsive to the community. I'm not predicting that, excuse me, I'm just saying that it certainly is possible.
Jeff, you have 2 minutes to wrap up.
Okay, all right, I'll finish up. So, and then speaking about power, I would have liked to hear more about the role of Palestinian Arab women, both organizationally in their what kind of feminist groups are Palestinian Arab feminist groups are pressing for reform, how successful might they be? But also we know that when women work, the more women work, the more they press for change. And so I guess I'm wondering, instead of just looking at law, can we look at power dynamics and also the sociological structure of what's going on? And when we know that when women work, they get more equality. This goes back to John Stuart Mill, but it also we know empirically this is true. So I mean, I think the way I'm going to end is by suggesting that I think Michael uses a legal framework, and as a lawyer, that makes sense. And there's a lot of talk about the power dynamics in the creation of these structures, but I would have liked to have heard a little more about the power dynamics that need to change or that we possibly can change to end some of these oppressive structures as well. And I think this lies kind of beyond multicultural theory, and instead we can look at the state, power, and internal communities, and how we can change those three together in some way. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So I hope everyone had a good break, and we're now back with Professor Daniel Statman. Please, Danny.
Okay.
You can do not. I think that I wouldn't close it entirely.
Hi. Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum salam.
For many years, I have shared Michael's concerns about the discrimination, prejudice, and hostility suffered by Palestinians in Israel. Actually, Michael reminded me recently that 20 years ago, after the events of October 2000, we thought we can fix the world together. So we decided we'd go together and address high school students, Jews and Arabs. So we went to one Arab school. Arabi, where was it? Berlin, right, Mar Elias. And then we went to a Jewish high school. I think it was the Real in Haifa.
You picked your schools well.
And if only we persisted, we might have changed the world. Maybe. Nonetheless, I find myself in disagreement with most of what he says in Multiculturalism and Entrapment. In these brief comments, I'll try to explain why. According to Karayanni, Israel's pretension to be implementing a multicultural policy vis-a-vis its non-Jewish religious groups is groundless. As he puts it, and I think this was already quoted today, conceiving the jurisdictional authority of the Palestinian Arab religious communities as a form of multicultural accommodation is just a facade. It is an effective mask in Ilan Saban's seminal paper on the collective rights of the Arab-Palestinian minority, Saban takes for granted that the self-governing rights of the non-Jewish religious courts are part and parcel of such a policy. His reservations are based only on the fact that, in his view, these rights are too limited. Why then does Michael refuse to see these rights for religious self-governance as multicultural? The answer is that, in Michael's view, the jurisdiction is, I quote, at its core, yet another form of oppression. This claim is comprised of two premises. A, the jurisdictional authority of the Palestinian Arab religious communities limits the autonomy of Palestinians in Israel rather than develops it. B, this result is not incidental but intentional. In Karayanni's view, a policy qualifies as multicultural only when it stems from respect for the minority cultures and expresses genuine care for their autonomy and identity. But in granting jurisdictional authority to Palestinian religious courts, Israel's objective is very different. It is, I quote again, to maintain their boxed-in identities, the Palestinian boxed-in identities, and ultimately to better control them and preserve Jewish identity. That's the real motivation here. Let me start with premise B. What Karayanni assumes here is that the multicultural policy qualifies as such only if the motivation underlying it is of the right kind, namely that it expresses genuine care for the well-being and the autonomy of the minority group members. But this condition seems to me implausible. To see why, I assume that Israel fully respected the right to free press of the Israeli Palestinians by allowing them to run as many and as diverse newspapers, radio channels, etc., as they like, and that it never intervened in their content. Assume further that this policy contributed to the further alienation of the Palestinians from Israel and from their Jewish fellow citizens. Finally, assume that the achievement of this alienation was what underlay Israel's policy in the first place. Nonetheless, it would seem odd to withhold the title free press when describing the policy at hand. In the scenario just described, the Arabs clearly had free press, even though it resulted in adverse effects for them, and even if such adverse effects were an explicit aim of the policy. The same applies to other state policies, including multiculturalism. A policy that helps minority cultures to survive and flourish by granting them language rights, autonomous schools, religious and other self-governing bodies, as shown in state symbols and so on, is multicultural, regardless of the motivation underlying it. I should add that central philosophers in the multicultural tradition, like Hildeka and Taylor, accept the appropriateness of justifications for multiculturalism that do not focus on the interests of the minority members, but on those of the majority, which assumingly benefit from the existence of cultural diversity. So the focus isn't on the minority members. So to conclude this point, it simply isn't the case that to describe some policy as multicultural, we need to make assumptions about the motivation of the state or of its officials, and we definitely don't need to ascribe to them some lofty moral aspiration like the realization of justice or the protection of rights. Be that as it may, let us take a closer look at the alleged problematic motivation that Karayanni ascribes to Israel. In Karayanni's view, I quote, a group defined itself not only by stressing its past, its culture, and so on, but also by stressing the divides that separate it from other groups. These divides become clearer if other groups are also pushed into preserving their own identity, The decision to preserve the millet system for the Palestinian-Arab minority was also guided by the hegemonic will of the Jewish majority in Israel to preserve its distinctiveness and identity, the Jewish distinctiveness and identity. I find this argument unconvincing. First, it's unclear how the existence of non-Jewish religious courts, with which most Israeli Jews are not even familiar, could help to preserve their Jewish religious identity. To the extent that it is concerned that Israel is concerned with preserving the religious nature of Israel, support for autonomous Christian and Muslim courts would be the least effective tool to deal with this need. Second, if to define itself as Jewish, Israel had to stress what separates her from other groups. This should have applied first and foremost to the Palestinian national minority in Israel, which is the main other in the eyes of most Israeli Jews. But needless to say, Israel does not push the Palestinian-Arabs in Israel to preserve and develop their culture, but if anything, the opposite. Third, this shaky assumption about Israel's true motivation is not really needed, because a simpler explanation for Israel's policy is available. Something along the following lines. Before the state was established, the different religious groups in Palestine already enjoyed jurisdictional authority in some legal areas, especially those concerning marriage and divorce. And Israel saw no good reason to change the status quo. The continued existence of such courts seemed natural, a perception which intensified after the legislation of the law of rabbinical courts in 1953. If Jews were put under the jurisdiction of rabbinical courts in matters of marriage and divorce, it seemed natural to subject non-Jewish citizens to the decisions of their religious courts. Thus, to understand how the non-Jewish religious courts came into existence, there's no need to rely on conspiracy theories like the one offered in the book. My fourth point is that when we explore Israel's attitude to its religious minorities, we should think mainly of the Muslims, who constitute 85% of the Arab Palestinian minority, while the Christians and Jews constitute less than 10% each. This is important for the present discussion because the strongest opposition to Israel and the strongest resistance to integration in its culture come from Muslim circles. Extremism, which is associated with violence and terror, is also more prevalent among devout Muslims than among devout Christians or Jews. In contrast to Karayanni's claim, what this means is that Israel's interest should have been to weaken rather than to preserve Muslim identity, among other ways, by acting to undermine the autonomy of Muslim courts and diluting the authority granted to imams and other religious leaders. The proposal that what motivated Israel in the establishment of non-Jewish courts, religious courts, was her interest in preserving the Jewish identity of the state, therefore, fails on its own terms, because this interest should have led Israel to introduce precisely the opposite policy. At this point, Michael might argue that there's an extra Israeli interest that motivates her support for the religious jurisdiction of the Palestinian-Arab minority, namely the wish to appear liberal in the eyes of the international community. But this community is actually deeply ambivalent about the merits of multiculturalism, with many arguing that it is dead. I mean, this is the phrase that's used in this discussion. Is multiculturalism dead? Against this background, it is not at all clear that in terms of PR, granting autonomy to religious courts, especially to Sharia courts, is better than subscribing to an uncompromising liberal individualist approach that frees individuals from any mandatory tie to the religious institutions of their cultural group. I turn now to premise A above, according to which the authority granted by Israel to Muslim, Jews, and Christian courts is a form of oppression. Michael is aware of the general tension between multiculturalism and the rights of individuals, especially of women, and he goes to great pains to show that in the case of Israel, the tension is especially disturbing. He believes that the Israeli Palestinians are more oppressed than their minority counterparts in other countries, that they are victims of severe oppression, imprisonment, and entrapment. This grim view of oppression meted out by the Palestinian religious courts faces an obvious objection, which Karayanni again notices. If the Palestinians in Israel are victims of such severe oppression, how come they're almost completely silent about it? In particular, how come the intellectual and political leaders hardly ever talk about it and make no serious effort to combat it? Michael's main response is that although many Palestinian Israelis I think we need to talk about the leaders in general, not only this argument, but I'm not sure this makes such a difference. And since such unity is critical to the Palestinian struggle for recognition and equality, those opposing the religious courts agree to sacrifice the interests of the oppressed, mainly women and children, for the sake of the Palestinian national interest. As Karayanni puts it, internal politics become focused on generating solidarity and unity, even if it is attained by entrenching patriarchy and repressing gender equality, okay? But it's hard to see why Palestinian solidarity would be so badly undermined by fighting for more gender equality in such a way that could justify giving up this fight. After all, the Palestinian society in Israel, like most societies, is divided on many lines: religious, ideological, political, economic, and the ongoing tensions and debates having to do with these divides haven't prevented the Palestinian leadership from leading an uncompromising campaign against the occupation and against the discrimination against Israeli Arabs. Why then should anybody fear that, in the case at hand, opposition to the religious courts would significantly undermine Palestinian unity? In other words, if the intellectual and political leaders of the Israeli Arabs had really been bothered by the severe oppression that Karayanni talks about, they wouldn't have refrained from fighting against it just because of the assumed adverse effects on Palestinian unity. So maybe the Palestinian leaders are simply not that bothered by what Karayanni regards as terrible oppression. And maybe the Palestinian population in general is not that bothered by it. Karayanni himself provides us with good reason to think that this indeed is the case. He concedes that, I quote, "There's virtually no active secular agenda on behalf of the Palestinian Arab parties, and certainly no anti-religious establishment activism, be it Muslim, Christian, or Druze." He goes further to suggest that the Palestinian Arab minority is still dependent on patriarchy as a social order, at least to some extent, which raises the suspicion that the majority of Palestinians in Israel don't feel the sense of oppression and entrapment that one would expect them to feel if Karayanni were right in his analysis. All this further undermines the speculation discussed earlier to the effect that the autonomy of non-Jewish religious courts results from the attempt of the Jewish majority to preserve its own Jewishness, plus a desire to improve Israel's reputation. Karayanni himself points to a much more plausible explanation. Most Israeli Arabs are by and large happy with this arrangement, or at any rate find it tolerable. Israel as a Jewish state has no special interest here, and therefore the state makes no effort to block reforms in the system of the sort described in chapter 6, which is a very important chapter. That such reforms have occurred in the last 20 years or so without the government or the Supreme Court trying to stop them, and in some cases thanks to the Supreme Court, is evidence that Israel has no hidden agenda that aims at making sure that these religious courts retain wide authority on matters of personal status. One might still wonder how come Israeli Palestinians accept the unfair state of affairs described by Michael, according to which, while the Supreme Court protects Jewish women from the oppression they suffer from rabbinical courts, thereby manifesting its liberal face, it disregards the interest of Palestinian women who suffer parallel oppression from non-Jewish courts, this time manifesting the facade of its multicultural face. My response is that this state of affairs simply doesn't exist. An in-depth study of rabbinical courts, Daphne Hacker has showed that in many respects these courts provide better services to their clients than civil secular courts. And in these respects, no intervention by the Supreme Court is called for. Similarly, in a forthcoming study, Chlaychel, Yefet, and Shachar have shown that regarding alimony claims, the Sharia courts in Israel are surprisingly more pro-women than the civil courts. In divorce disputes, by contrast, the rabbinical courts notoriously fight to assert their jurisdiction and strive for autonomous jurisprudence. This is a quote from Hacker. But in regard to these disputes, even the Supreme Court can't help. For instance, can't declare a marriage void until the husband agrees to give his wife a gift. So, in issues other than divorce, Jewish as well as Muslim women are relatively well treated by their respective religious courts, not because of some liberal agenda of the Supreme Court or of the state, but because, I quote Hacker, the ultra-Orthodox judges of the rabbinical courts seem to share the general public opinion that women should not be discriminated against in inheritance, unquote, an opinion generally shared by Muslim judges as well. By contrast, in divorce disputes, Jewish and Palestinian women alike are at the mercy of their religious courts, with the civil courts being able to grant very limited remedies. Let me make one last point. For the reason mentioned above, Karayanni believes that Israel's policy vis-à-vis its Palestinian minority is unequivocally not multiculturalism. That's a quote, not multiculturalism. His claim is that is not that it's multiculturalism, that it's multiculturalism is partial or in need of reform, but it's not multiculturalism at all. In spite of the fact that Israel supports public schools that teach in Arabic, that it grants Arabic a special status, that it acknowledges Muslim and Christian days of rest, that it made it mandatory to guarantee representation for them in the public service, and so on and so forth. In spite of all these policies, Israel is not a multicultural state at all. Similarly, Karayanni says, again, in a very sweeping way, that Israel is not a Western democracy. Not that it's a democracy that needs improvement, but not a democracy at all.
Is that
against this approach, I contend that the use of adjectives like democratic, liberal, and multicultural are not a matter of yes or no, but a matter of degree. Descriptively, Israel is definitely above the threshold that makes the ascription of all three adjectives to her plausible, which of course leaves everything open regarding the extent of her success in living up to the expectations that they bring with them. Thank you very much.
Thank you for keeping the time so perfect. So we had to have some kind of action, right?
It's I feel an urge of, just responding at once, but then I would, and I would have a criminal defense even if I would have not. Anyway, but.
Okay, so it has been long since someone said occupation in the room, right?
Yeah.
So at least we heard that. Okay, so thank you very much, Danny, and Raef, the floor is yours.
Okay. Thank you all. Thank you for writing this book. Thank you for inviting me to talk about this book. I'll make my comments short. There would be different from what I present in the paper because I want to focus on 2-3 points. Otherwise, we'll miss the points. So in the overall, I think I stand behind the general thesis of this book. I was a lawyer. I practiced law in religious court. It's a disaster. This is one. And the fact that we cannot imagine that there is a civic community in Israel, it becomes so natural that it is in itself disaster that inhabits the political imaginary of the people in this place. It's not that we only entrapped, the Jews are also entrapped in their own ghetto. So I make basically 3 main comments, and I start from an experience. I was visiting South Africa before 3 years ago. I went to the Apartheid Museum, and I listened to the speeches in the 50s and the 60s. You can take those speeches and make them speeches for multiculturalism. The speeches stress the fact that we are all human, but God created us different in race and culture, and everyone can flourish his own way. There are too many ways to bloom. Now, how to make sense of that? It's not an easy answer what to make sense of that. And in order to make sense of that, I want to make an intellectual elegantly by the short essay of Karl Marx on the Jewish question. This is the process of bracketing difference and the return of difference. The language of entrapment is the language of feudalism, because in feudalism, you are born with a certain rubric and you die within the rubric that you were born into. Your past is your future. Your locus socially decides everything. And if you are a Jew and you go out from the door to the public sphere, you take your Jewishness with you to the public sphere, in the sense that the laws that apply to you are different from the laws that apply to the Catholic different from the Protestant. In this sense, not only religion is public, but your poverty is public, because participation in the political public sphere hinges on owning property. Thus, property is public because it is the condition of the participation in politics. In this sense, having a social status and a political status is one and the same. To be a lord or a duke in Europe of the 18th century is at the same difference, is a prelude to enmity. So this is a slippery slope. This is always problematic. Too much difference is a problem. Too little difference is a problem. So that's one way that I wanted to locate the discussion in a historical frame. Okay, 9 minutes. I have another 7. The second point I want to make, actually I made it in a paper 7 years ago. I don't know why I didn't publish it. It's probably time to publish it. The problem that Israel, all the time you have new things, by the time you make up your mind, they're already.
That's the story of my life as a constitutional law teacher.
Change the subject.
I need to.
The issue that I want to put on the table is what probably in the literature is called culture talk. Now I want to express some really being tired and dissatisfied from the culture talk that takes Israel problem, Jewish democratic state. And I want to replace it as if there's contradiction between Jewish and democratic. And so much ink has been put by liberal Zionists to convince us that there is no contradiction between Jewish and democratic. And too much ink by Palestinian intellectual has been to show us that there is a contradiction between Jewish and democratic. I'm bored, I have to say. Because the problem of Jewish and democratic is not logical problem. It's political, historical problem. And I think we all fall in a trap to solve political questions through logical formulas. Jewish and democratic could be reconciled. Could be reconciled because they stress different principles. And as we know, we have too many values in life, too many commitments, and sometimes we must find a way. Welcome to life. The problem with the Jewish and democratic, it's not logical. The problem is political. And as such, the problem, it's not because the Jewish has a character. So most of the writings about the character of the state, we are not atomized self, we belong to certain culture, we want to our Hebrew language to flourish, we want the Sabbath, we want the holidays, and we want the symbol. Take all the symbols. I don't need all liberal communitarian that write me articles how culture matters. I know how much culture matters. I learned that already from Vico, Herder, Hegel, or the German Romanticism, and from Barak-Corren. I know that. I'm ready to grant the importance of culture. And I'm not a liberal cosmopolitan. I know that states have, by definition, culture. You must have a holiday. You don't have to, you have to choose. Friday, you must have a language. You don't speak Esperanto. That's not the problem. And that's why I think insisting on this problem is just wasting efforts. The problem with the Jewish state is twofold. First of all, it's not a state, it's a movement. We're not facing a state, it's not static. It doesn't have a constitution. It doesn't have a border, it has frontiers. It doesn't have a constitution because it doesn't want to limit itself, because it's an ongoing revolution. Why an ongoing revolution? Because it's aimed to negate the exile. It aims to settle the land of Israel. It's all the time on the move, expanding. The Sheikh from Sheikh Jarrah to the new settlement in the West Bank. It knows no limit. It's not a state, it's a movement. It's a settlement movement that takes the existence of the Palestinians as a problem and they don't know what to do with it. So they assign indirect rule. So the antagonism is not a transcendence in time, which is culture basically. It's transcendence in space. The struggle is over land, planning, housing, capturing the land and expanding in space. This is the site of the conflict. Now, to turn a conflict which is political, about power, about geography, and about space, to culture talk, it's good for both sides. It's good for the Jewish majority and it's good for the Palestinian minority. Because culture talk and multiculturalism, with the language of rights, it gives a sense that we can continue the conversation. But the site of the problem is somewhere else. So really, in my better moods, I'm ready to accept many communitarian insight about the self, about culture, and about religion.
Have you ever had that?
Sorry? I mean, I take the opposite position from my discussant. If I face a liberal, I become communitarian. If I go communitarian, if I face both of them, I become Marxist. If I face the three, I take the position of Jean-Paul Sartre. I become existentialist. So the repertoire is full. So in this sense, I think...
That's a lawyer in that.
Yeah, I'm ready to finish actually now.
1 minute.
So if I want to finish with 1 minute, 3 points after all that I want to suggest as things to think about for you, Michael. It would be good if you tell us where you're making critique of Israel and when you make critique of multiculturalism, because some of your critiques are critique of multiculturalism, by definition, not exactly critique of Israel, or they apply motu mutandis for Israel, but they are critiques of any multiculturalism. The fear of entrapment, Susan Oken doesn't speak about Israel. She speaks that multiculturalism is bad for women, it's bad for minority within the minority.
Actually, she gave that speech at Hebrew Youth, coming to Israel and talking about
she doesn't stop to speak about that speech. She's been talking about this for the last 20 years. I hope.
Multiculturalism said it, so it's not so.
She's been dead for 10 years.
The other point about the private paradigm and the private liberal and the public illiberal, I think it would be interesting to see if these are actually two different questions. It's not that there's one question is about the establishment clause, and the other question is about freedom of exercise. And we most of the time think that these are one question, but you can think of non-establishment clause with countries that don't give any freedom, take the Soviet Union, etc., and vice versa. So I think if you try to think about these two paradigms in the relation of these two different questions, maybe they map onto this question, not that these are completely two different, they are just two different questions, not that they are two different answers to the same question. Because my time is over, that's what you do to Palestinians always. Okay, thank you.
Okay, so Amihai, we now need to see some things flying in the air.
Some historical points, yeah.
So Amihai prepared slides. That's a novelty. So it's on the desktop.
Finally.
Wait, here.
Thank you very much. Okay, Michael and I have known each other for many years, so it is a great joy for me to speak here this evening. Many thanks to Netta for the invitation and also to the other organizers of this symposium. The book before us is a thorough and rich, and as someone who deals with family law in Israel and its history, I must say that it sharpened my understanding and provided many new insights for me. I would like to share with you some thoughts the book prompt regarding the comparison with halachic law, the Jewish law in Israel, which is the focus of my work. I will divide my remarks into three issues. I hope I will have the time. Religious struggle concerning family law legislation, segmentation of the Arab population into subgroups, and changes in the law due to external influences. Okay, what do I need to do in order to...
Nothing much.
Okay.
Wait, should we go back?
Yeah. Okay. In the third chapter of the book, Michael discusses three laws from the 50s. The law of succession, age of marriage law, and women's equal rights law. Although the law of succession was not passed until 1965, the initial bill was published as early as 1952, and the ideological discussions over it were conducted mainly in the 50s. These discussions are of interest to me here. I refer to what Michael writes on page 69. In some cases, such as in the succession law, the borrowing from Jewish law went one step further to incorporate actual norms rather than just phrases. In an article dealing with this law, I showed that this is indeed what transpires from the explanatory notes to the law and from the discussions about it. But in practice, these were only statements, and Jewish law did not serve as a significant source for the law. This is also important in light of what I will say presently. Now, indeed, by and large, Michael's argument is that these laws did try to apply modern norms to the population of Israel, and mostly to improve the status of women, but they did too little. First, because there was room for broader civil legislation and the creation of a complete civil system in family law, which of course did not happen and probably will not happen anytime soon. Second, especially with regard to the marriage age law and the equal rights of women law, which prohibited bigamy also for Muslims, Michael argues quite rightly that these laws suffer from lack of enforcement. You can see the data on the slide regarding the marriage law, that we have some 1,400 cases of girls' marriage that we know about, and only some 40 cases that most of them were closed. And yet, I think, moreover, these two laws, as well as the provisions of the law of succession, are not always observed because often the internal social norms of religious groups override the provisions of the law. And yet, I think that it makes sense to look at things also from a historical point of view, which allows us to see, in my opinion, the half-full glass. In the fourth chapter, Michael discusses what he calls minority politics, including the internal opposition of by the religious establishment to changes in family law led by a secular legislation under the influence of Western norms, which is true of many countries. In Israel, of course, the national dimension must be added, which is, in Michael's words, about a legitimacy deficit, but this time one preventing Palestinian-Arabs from applying to Israeli establishment institutions in order to reform their internal norms, end quote. Now, okay. An example of this is the significant proposal to amend the Ottoman family law of 1917, which still applies to Muslims in Israel without any changes. I'm not entirely familiar with the details, but from what I know, this impressive proposal was shelved because of opposition from the Sharia establishment and out of fear that it would not achieve sufficient consensus within Muslim society in Israel. Now, the three above-mentioned laws from the 50s are an example of cases in which the state has enacted laws despite the known opposition of religious circles. It is important to emphasize that this is not only opposition from the Muslim or Christian direction, but also a very strong opposition that came from the direction of the religious establishment of the Jewish majority. We can be seen here that the states came up against, even if only partially, conservative approaches that oppose changes in family law. We have seen similar examples in later periods, such as the financial relations between spouses law of 1973 and the significant amendment of 2008, both of which were met with a fierce opposition from the rabbinical courts. Below are a few examples concerning the laws from the 50s that I mentioned. Okay. We know that there was a strong opposition to the succession law voiced by various rabbis, including the chief rabbis, and by religious politicians. A main problem was one that Michael mentions in several places, the fact that the law has effectively obliterated the authority of religious courts to adjudicate inheritance matters, except in the relatively few cases where there is a consent by all concerned. Here is a letter of protest sent by the representative of the Latin Patriarch in Israel, which states that the law actually harms the institution of family according to the Catholic concept and violates the principles of religions. In Hebrew, מכניסה אותנו לבעיה הרבה יותר חשובה, והיא בעיות המשפחה, שלפי המושג הנוצרי הוא מוסד קדוש מטיב הבריאתו. And here is a letter from a Qadi talking about the mortal blow to the Sharia courts in Israel, which have a long and glorious history, and to the entire Muslim population. And note the response of Yaakov Yehoshua, the director of the Muslim department at the Ministry of Religious Affairs, and also the father of Aleph Bet Yehoshua. The Jewish courts are also denied authority, and with all the due respect to the history of the Muslim courts, they will have to adapt to this new situation. Indeed, as I have already said, the Jewish establishment also opposed the law. The opposition was from factors whose weight was probably much greater than that of the Arab religious figures and politicians. Here, for example, don't know if you can see it, is Uri Yadin's letter describing the heavy pressure of the religious Jewish ministers, in particular on the issue of jurisdiction, but also the firm opposition of the Ministry of Justice against it, which eventually prevailed. I can give similar examples in relation to the equal rights of women law and to the marriage age law. These laws also prompt strong letters of opposition from Muslim, Christian, and Jewish actors. For example, the marriage age law was met with the reservations from Jewish religious actors even after it was enacted, and pressure was exerted to lower the marriage age. This is a bill by the Minister of Religious Affairs, Moshe Shapira, which proposes two dramatic changes: lowering the marriage age to 16 and giving religious courts the authority to grant marriage permits to minors, and authorities they were not granted until this day, despite various pressures over the years. Notice Shapira's arguments. The existing law is not appropriate either for Eastern or Mizrahi Jews or for Christian and Muslims. Nevertheless, the proposal was naturally not approved by the government. And we may remember that even the strong opposition of the Jewish ultra-Orthodox Knesset members to the raising of marriage age to 18 in 2013, and this was not accepted, of course. In sum, I argue that despite objections from various religious denominations to these bills, the legislator made no significant changes in them. Therefore, in light of the liberal point of view voiced by Michael Books, the State of Israel took a stand, which is a commendable position, even if in the end, this law did not fully succeed in the mission. Now to the second point. In the first chapter of the book, Michael talks about the internal tensions that exist within the Arab minority group in Israel between Muslim, Christian, and Druze. In the fourth chapter appears a claim, which Michael is not the first to voice, and he bases it on archival documents, that the state of Israel has acted to weaken the Arab society by dividing it into subgroups. It did this by using the Millet system, as Michael puts it in page 163. I will quote, in this respect, the existing religious divisions among the Palestinian Arab community, as dictated by the Millet system, proved to be an important resource, the exploitation of which could optimize segmentation and therefore control. Indeed, Israel did not invent the Millet system, but given its existence and Israel policy of control, the system was enforced rather than weakened, end quote. I think there is truth in this claim for two reasons. First, as Michael himself writes on page 85, the state of Israel has added new religious denominations. This was a departure from the policy of the British mandate. The mandatory authorities granted official recognition only to religious denominations already recognized by the Ottoman authorities. That is, they acted to preserve the Millet regime in its original form. But, therefore, the Druze thought, there is a letter about the Druze community, the Druze thought recognition as an independent community were not recognized as a separate religious community from Sunni Islam because they had no such official recognition during the Ottoman period. The mandatory authorities claimed that the Druze and like them, the Baha'is, were Muslims and therefore belonged to the Muslim community. Even the Anglican or evangelical Episcopal community did not have the official status of a recognized denomination under the British mandate, despite the fact that the upper crust of the British administration belonged to this church on the formal grounds of lack of official recognition of this church during the Ottoman period, although the true reason may have been such different. Yet, these three denominations, the Druze, the Anglicans, and the Baha'is, were officially recognized as a religious community in the state of Israel. And here I come to the second point. There is no doubt that those communities sought recognition as independent religious denomination, both during the mandate period and within the state of Israel. In my opinion, it was the right thing to do to satisfy their demand. The point is, as Michael writes, that similar calls from minority groups in the Jewish religious community seeking recognition were met with outright refusal. Whereas the state of Israel did not refrain from splitting non-Jewish communities, it never agreed to act in a similar manner toward the Jewish community and endeavor to maintain its legal uniformity. The most prominent example is, of course, the Karaite group, which actually was recognized as a religious community in the Ottoman Empire. During the mandate rule, there was no such recognition because there were very few Karaites in Palestine. But the question arose again after the establishment of the state and after the arrival of many Karaites. The Karaite community did not receive the status of a recognized religious community from the state of Israel. But the state of Israel didn't recognize. And we can see it also here in this.
So the Karaites are not recognized?
No. What is that? Okay. It's noted that the Karaites have never been recognized as a separate denomination, and the status has not been settled to this day. This reality has led to several petitions to the High Court, and it is worth quoting from the last one, the word of Justice Eliakim Rubinstein. The issue of the status of the Karaite Jewish community has been raised in the past in this court. it has been determined that the Karaite rabbinical court operates without legal basis. It is worth emphasizing that at the national level, this is the important word, in the national level, the Karaite community is part of the Jewish population. Yet the status of its courts remains unregulated despite attempts to propose legislation, which at the end of the day did not succeed. In other words, it is also clear to the Supreme Court that the Karaites are part of the Jewish public and therefore not entitled to recognition as a separate denomination. Other groups within the Jewish community were not recognized either. A prominent example is the ultra-Orthodox anti-Zionist body known as Aida Haredit. Already during the mandate period, Aida Haredit, represented by the Agudat Israel movement, tried to gain the independent legal status of a separate denomination, and in any case not to be subject to the jurisdiction of the Jewish chief rabbinate, which applies only to the members of the organized Jewish body called Knesset Israel. The opposition to subordination to the chief rabbinate was not only perceived by Aida Haredit as operating under the authority of a Zionist body, Knesset Israel and Avada Leumi, the chief rabbinate was also perceived as illegitimate because part of Knesset Israel leaders were secular and women could elect and be elected to the assembly of Knesset Israel. The ultra-Orthodox Jews of Jerusalem also claimed that the court of the chief rabbinate acted contrary to the traditional halakha, in particular because court of appeals was established in this system without any solid halakhic basis. But the mandatory authorities did not recognize Aida Haredit as a separate religious community, and its tribunal had not independent status. Therefore, the writ of divorce, Gitin, issued by it were not recognized by the authorities for registration unless approved by the chief rabbinate. Even the de facto recognition of Aida Haredit registration of marriage between its members was revoked by the High Court in 1942. Not surprisingly, the establishment of the State of Israel did not change, of course, this situation. Although the intention of the chief rabbinate in the 50s to completely abolish the separate rabbinical courts did not materialize. All that Aida Haredit achieved through the negotiations with state authorities was the preservation of the status quo. In other words, a Badat, or the religious court of Aida Haredit, can hold independent hearings in divorce cases, but the legitimate official status is achieved only if the divorce is approved by the recognized Jewish court. That is the official supreme rabbinical court of the State of Israel. In sum, indeed, as Michael claims, while new religious denominations have been added to the non-Jewish population over the years, the Jewish community has remained one and the same, and all the attempts to gain recognition, even partial, of subgroups status within it have failed. How many times? Just just few words about the last point. Okay, in the 6th chapter of the books is a more optimistic chapter. It outlines several ways that nevertheless had led to a certain improvement in family law in Israel, especially in the non-Jewish population, and this without a dramatic change in religious family law applicable in the State of Israel. One of the ways Michael points at is the transparency of religious courts. He speaks, for example, about the publication of the Sharia court rulings in the wake of Musa Aburabia's petition to the Supreme Court. I very much agree. I have no doubt that there have also been dramatic internal changes in the system of rabbinical courts as a result of the publication of court rulings to the more significant degree since the beginning of the current century. Indeed, for 80 years, since the chief rabbinate was established by the mandatory authorities in 1921, a mere few hundred rulings had been published, and for many years we have had not a single verdict published. After the electronic publication of rulings began, however, we already have several thousand today, mainly from recent years. This is a huge improvement, first of all, for those who want to know what is going on inside the rabbinical courts, for example, lawyers, and for those who want to critically examine the activities of the courts, for example, academics or various women's organizations. But it's important to say that this is also affect rabbinical judges or dayanim. First, because they are aware that there may be someone who will read their judgments and criticize them. Second, because ideas sometimes relatively liberal, developed by a particular rabbinical judge, are disseminated through publication, through publicizing, and other judges may be willing to adapt them. So I just moved to the end. Much more could be said about the book, and I wrote a lot, but we will stop here. Just 2 points to conclude. First, many thanks to Michael for a thought-provoking book. Second, I hope you will delight us with another book soon.
Wonderful way you conclude. Is this a Jerusalem one?
Yeah.
It's just because Raef said before that we're in Jerusalem, not in Tel Aviv, so I figured it out.
No, that's not the right.
Oh, it's not the right, so you said. I should have asked.
No, it's, I can't see the
You will
slide.
see it in a second.
Just, how do I move?
Wait, let me drag that to the side. I hope you don't have any text here. And then you can just move
With this, yeah?
like that. You can tap.
Okay.
And do them back if you need.
Yeah, okay. All right. Okay, so without further ado, first of all, thank you, Netta, for organizing this symposium. For Ido, I think he can hear us for attending to all of the technicalities, and for all of the commentators and the attendees of the symposium. And those on Zoom who participated and heard much of the comments. Actually, I feel a bit awkward because, you know, I've said almost all what I needed to say in the book itself. So I think I'm just repeating some of the things I've said. And so I'll constrain my comments to main points made, just to maybe relate to some of the comments made here. As to Rawia, she does capture the essence of my book, but I don't have a broken dream of multiculturalism. I never claimed to have a dream of multiculturalism, other than, yeah, people in a disadvantaged status should be accommodated. So if this is what I dream of, and I think I share this dream with a lot of other people, then yeah, I'm a proud multiculturalist anyway. But the book actually is about a characterization, a classification that is very dominant in the Israeli literature, Jeff, and it might be the exception in global scholarly work, but you've just heard Statman, and maybe Israel hasn't gone far enough in its multicultural policy when it comes to the Palestinian-Arab religious communities, and he's citing an article by Ilan Sabat, which, if you read the book, it's been an argument that has resonated in Israel much before Ilan's argument, even in the official publications of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And I thought that you would be contesting my contestation of your argument in the book, which you haven't. So I take it that maybe you're in agreement with my contestation of what you said, since this is something you haven't raised. Anyway, but I'll take whatever you're.
It's very dangerous.
Yeah, I mean,
Please,
you know, defend your claim before discrediting mine, but this is not what you've done. So I'm thankful for accepting. And in legal terms, if you don't deny my claim, anyway, that's the thing. Anyway, so in terms of what I was trying to make is, this is a very dominant argument that surfaces much in the literature and in the official publications, that when it comes to the Palestinian Arab minority, the recognition for their religious authority is a kind of concession. It's a kind of toleration. It's a kind of accommodation. And this is what makes it different from the Jewish religious jurisdiction, which is not. Okay, so this is a basic distinction. So when I disqualify or argue against this classification, this characterization, I'm not dreaming of multiculturalism. I'm just saying it doesn't work. This is not how multiculturalism works, because if you're claiming it is, it is not. But then insisting on it raises the question, Danny, why are you insisting when it is evidently not multicultural? Okay?
Could you explain that?
Yeah. Okay. So I'll get to that in a moment, because if you've read the book, actually, I offer you 4 explanations why it doesn't qualify as multicultural. 4, not 1, 4. And you didn't even bother to mention any other qualifications. I gave you qualifications. I mean, come on, if you've read the book, you would at least relate to what was I saying, and even that, you have not. Now, so Rawia, I'm not thinking of multiculturalism as being my prototype. But if this is the claim, it simply doesn't work. And turning now to Jeff, just to show you, this is Yitzhak Kahan speaking of how he relates to the jurisdictional authority of Palestinian-Arab religious courts. So you have underneath the English translation, and in Hebrew, Haroshim hu שהפירוש המרחיב לסמכות בתי הדין הדתיים של הלא יהודים. This is the president of the Israeli Supreme Court, who became the president. He was then the associate justice of the Supreme Court, and then he is telling you, I don't know what your citations are, that הרושם הוא שהפירוש המרחיב לסמכות בתי הדין הדתיים של לא יהודים מושפע מחשש שלא לפגוע במה שבעיני מיעוט לאומי נראה כחלק חשוב מהאוטונומיה התרבותית והלאומית. הפירוש המרחיב, we're expanding the jurisdictional authority of these courts. This is how we are acting actually as against how we're acting vis-a-vis the rabbinical courts, which is הפירוש המצמצם. I didn't invent it. You know where it was stated? It was stated by Pinchas Shifan. So if you have even read the book, you would say, this is what Shifan is saying. You know, Shifan is not just another scholar. He's the premier scholar in family law. מסופוקני אם בית המשפט העליון פועל למשל בדרך פרשנות מצמצמת בידונו בסמכויות בתי הדין האחרים בענייני המעמד האישי. This is not how the Supreme Court acts when it comes to the non-religious jurisdiction. This is Yitzhak Engler, right? And I think this is my piece of evidence. So if Saban has claimed it, be sure it's not just Saban. If you look here, and if you've looked at the book, you'll find other people who have claimed the same proposition, right? So Saban is from 2004. And this is a publication by the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs from 1961. Now let's look at the text and try to understand what the text is saying. Comfortably with the injunctions of their faith, the laws vests in the religious community's authority in matters of personal status. In fact, the Muslims and Christian religious courts have jurisdictional powers exceeding those of the Jewish rabbinic courts. Now, this is the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. This state of religious judicial autonomy continues, note that it's judicial autonomy, to be maintained in Israel. Lately, indeed, it has been extended to the Druze community, and the Druze religious courts are now being established. At the same time, an entirely different process has been taking place where? In the neighboring Arab countries. In Egypt, for instance, Sharia courts and the courts of other religious communities were abolished in 1956. Now, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs is not trying to praise Egypt of what it was doing by abolishing its religious courts. This is 1961. This is Egypt of Jamal Abdel Nasser. Evidently, the text is making the point that when it comes to the Arab religious communities, our recognition is the concession. Our recognition is the tolerant attitude. But look at what Chaim Cohen is saying about the rabbinical jurisdiction. סוף דבר הכל נשמע. השיפוט הרבני הוא כתם על השלטון המשפט הדמוקרטי. It's a block. Look at the difference. I mean, who was Chaim Cohen, right? If you want to relate to history. Who was Chaim Cohen then? He was a minister of justice for, I think, some months. He was Praklit Amdina, the chief prosecutor. In the 1950s, he was the attorney general of the Israeli state. And then he was a long-time associate justice who then became the deputy chief justice of Israel. And this is what he's saying. So I think you can see the difference. And you know what about conspiracy? I have some handouts. Let's read some texts here. Founding what I have to say. And this is another text you can share. Two texts, okay? Here. This is the second text. If you need some more, just to give you an impression, if you would have read the book and seen the citations, I mean, I'm not just inventing these things now. They're all in the book itself. Let's take this first one. Medinat Israel, Mehleket HaChinuch. Look at how this text is classified. Sudi, okay? Secret. Which implies that when things are classified as such, people are more open in saying things that they will not usually be saying when it is public, right? Sudi. And this is some of the archival work. I would like you to look at the third paragraph. והנה הרצה לפניי דוקטור הרשברג את השקפתו המיוסדת על גישה שונה לגמרי. The guy wanted to have an equal treatment of Arabs and Jews in schools. But then came Hirschberg. I'll explain. And if you've read the book, you know. ועידות שונות כגון מוסלמים, נוצרים לכתותיהם, דרוזים, צ'רקסים, יוונים, ארמנים ולא סתם ערבים. הוא אומר שהדרוזים טוענים שאינם ערבים, הצ'רקסים ודאי שאינם ערבים, ולגמרי לא מובן מאליו שיש ללמד אותם ערבית. במילים אחרות אין לפנינו בעיה אחת של ערבים, אלא בעיות של עדות ואומות שונות. ועלינו לפתור אותן כל אחת לחוד ולהדגיש, to emphasize, ולהדגיש ולפתח, and to develop את הניגודים. This is Hebrew, right? שבין הסוגים השונים ולמעט את הערביות שלהם. Is this good enough evidence? I mean, about stressing the difference based on their religion? בדרך זו הם ישכחו שהם ערבים וידעו שהם ישראלים ממינים שונים. I mean, come on, give me a break. What do you need more from this kind of direct evidence?
Maybe translate to English.
Yeah. It's in the book, Jeff. You can look it up under the title of Control by Accommodation. I speak on this for about 4 pages, right? And all of these archival materials are documented. And this was not a coincidence. Let's take a look at the other documents that I've circulated. Raef Herzog, this is Yaakov Herzog, right? מסתייג מהרעיון, another discussion, internal discussion. הרב הרצוג מסתייג מהרעיון ששר הדתות ימנה את השופטים. Sorry. תהיה בזה הפליה לרעה של המוסלמים ביחס לנוצרים שלהם הוקנתה ופתיחה אוטונומיה וכן ביחס ליהודים. בשום כך יש לנהוג בזהירות רבה. בדרך כלל אין אנו מעוניינים בגיבוש מיעוטים לאומיים ונשתדל לנהל את כל העניינים על רקע עדתי דתי. When I discuss, the history, I bring that there were other issues, but you can't deny that there was this tendency of stressing the religious, ethnic difference as a matter of an institutional interest. So I don't know, when you claim what you claim, are you basing your claims on something other than, hinting or having an intuition? This is facts. I mean, these are documents that really state what I was trying to do in the book. As Rawia said that I leave the question open about Israel's democracy, this is one thing I think Danny has right, is that this is the only thing I think Danny has right, is I'm claiming that Israel is not a Western democracy. Right? In this chapter that you're quoting, the heading is the quandary of the Israeli establishment. I'm presenting myself as, and in the Arabic kind of a dragon, itab, listen, at least history would tell. As to the issue of the post-colonial, right? I write this on page 240. Additionally, this study offers raw material for modern theories relating to the nature of Israel's constitutional order, especially in relation to its Palestinian minority. This includes such critical theories as surveillance, post-colonial, settler colonial, critical race studies, and more. You're more free than to take up. What I've tried to do here is not theorize what this case is, but more to discredit what this case has been claimed to be. And this was actually the project. Back to Statman's, one might still wonder how come Israeli Palestinians accept the unfair state of affairs described by Karayanni. I mean, this is really essentialism and Orientalism, I must say, at its best. What do you mean by Palestinians accept? Have you asked Palestinians whether they accept? I mean, you have Rawia Aburabia, who wrote a PhD. Maram Ibrahim is writing a PhD. You have Raef Zreik I. Have you asked anybody?
I'm quoting you. You say that.
No, I don't say. I said the political establishment.
What's the establishment?
The political establishment.
I'm happy to limit what I said to the political establishment.
Yeah.
Which usually sees itself as representing the Arabs.
No, it doesn't represent necessarily my view on the topic.
I didn't say necessarily. I didn't mean every individual. But usually we take them as representing the interests of the Palestinians in Israel.
Let me just continue, right? If you're interested in hearing what the Arabs have to say, I brought you some, booklets. You're free. It's in Hebrew, English, and Arabic. You can take a look at what was. Yeah. Okay. So on the issue of liberal interpretation and limited interpretation, have you read what I've said about Qatar, the decision of Qatar? Do you know what that decision is? It's about. Do you know what?
The entire chapter 6, I think.
No, it's not in chapter 6.
Okay,
but you know what Qatar, the decision of Qatar is?
Qatar?
Yeah, Qatar. It's about the Druze court's jurisdiction over people living in the Golan Heights. Okay? So, do you know Sima Levy's decision on subject matter jurisdiction? Have you read what I've written on incidental jurisdiction? The Badr Mir'i. Have you read what I wrote in the book? Have you read about paternity claims of Muslims? No, I'm just, I don't know where you come up with these arguments. If the Palestinians in Israel are victims of such severe oppression, come on, give me a break. They're intellectuals. Have you heard what intellectuals have said? Have you read of any of these booklets? Where do you come up with these arguments? And if the intellectuals and political leaders had really been bothered, I mean, don't you think that we're really bothered of what's happening? Come on, where are you coming up with these arguments? Just to tell you what our community is today, this is Ayman Safi. He was an openly gay individual. He tragically drowned on a beach in Athlete. He was openly gay. He wasn't just openly gay. He was on TV saying that he was openly gay. And this was the announcement of his death, announcing his death. And look at the end. تقبل التعازي حتى يوم السبت من الساعة 12 ظهرا في قاعة كنيسة الميلاد. Condolences would be accepted at the church, and his burial في المقبرة الإسلامية, in the Islamic cemetery. Is this something that كفر يسيف تشيع السواد أيمن هاشم صفي يرفع الأذان وتقرأ أجراس الكنائس? The imam would be praying in the mosque, and the bells of the church would be ringing. This is his funeral, and openly gay. Is this the community you're speaking about? Are these the intellectuals, right? You can see Aida Touma here. You can see Ayman Odi. This is Rawda Mur'us here. She's an openly lesbian in our village. You can see a Greek Orthodox priest. Intellectuals. حقوق النساء والأحوال الشخصية. This is 273-page document by lawyers writing against, critically, of religious jurisdiction in Arabic. Are these the intellectuals you're depicting? Right? What Karmit Yafe and Eido Shahar wrote about, now they're better treated. This is something that appears here in Arabic, and it was published way before, and it is actually documented in the book itself. If you've read in the book, what they're writing about in terms of what happened, right? After the amendment 5, you can take a look at page 252 to page 253, right? The importance of Amendment 5 lies not only in the recourse it now provides Muslims and Christian women to more sympathetic civil forum. it is also apparent in the pressure it created within the religious establishment itself to reform its internal norms and practices. This is here. I didn't need, it's documented, but when did it happen? It only happened when there was a reasonable exit. And when there's a reasonable exit, then you have a more meaningful voice. This is speaking of intellectuals, right? This is something, a conference that is happening this Saturday in Nazareth. Al-Gender, Ad-Din wa Dawli. Gender, religion, and the state. قضايا الأحوال الشخصية والنضال النسوي الفلسطيني. Issues of personal status and the struggle of Palestinian women. It's intellectual. I can go on and take you compare it to the freedom of press. Come on. What freedom of press has to do with this here? You're making people be under exclusive jurisdiction of their religious authority. Is that giving them freedom? If this is an analogy that you're making, right, that I want to claim maybe I'm the Mahatma Gandhi, I don't know. Is granting exclusive jurisdiction to all of these religious courts, it's like granting the freedom of press? What kind of analogy is this? So, yeah, you speak of divorce, that it is the only thing that maybe is still governed and equally. But when you don't have an exit from marriage because of the limited opportunities of divorce, which I also explained, right? No exit from marriage because you don't have a divorce. You know how that implicates the lives of women within the marriage relationship? Yeah, because men, at least under Islamic Sharia, they can divorce unilaterally, but women cannot. Okay, and men can have these extramarital relationships more easily. Right. But when you don't have an exit from divorce, what kind of life would a miserable woman have in such a marriage? So that's just affecting divorce. It's affecting daily life. It's not just the divorce. Speaking of Sharia courts, you know that the testimony of two women is equal to one man in the Sharia. Is that something that you would be tolerating under moral philosophy? Danny, if corporal punishment is accepted in the Hasidic community, right? If that something is a command I follow, would you accept it? So even if there were only a few Palestinians against this religious authority, is this something that you would still deem as being multicultural? What kind of argument is this? So actually, with all due respect, you speak of the Muslims producing this terror, and so Israel, if it was against the Muslims, it should take that jurisdiction. You know, it reminds me of the issue of Hamas and Israel. So Israel was for fundamentalist Islam in the West Bank. It's a long story. So now it makes no sense that because Islam has turned on Israel that it was for Islam before. I mean, look at how fundamentalist Islam developed in the West Bank as an opposition motivated by Israel against the PLO. Look at the Taliban. Okay, the Talibans today are against the US. Now, what kind of logic, right, would say that now it can't be that the US was for the Taliban? But historically, it was when it was had a fighting with the Soviet Union. So what kind of, logic, what kind of academic foundations you're claiming what you're claiming? So I find your claims baseless with all due respect, and I reciprocate the implausibility of anything you've argued in this response with all due respect. And with this, I will end. Thank you.
I'm not entirely sure, but I think there may be a bit of tension in the room, a little bit. And I want to comment on the conspiracy theory controversy here. And the way I want to bring peace and alleviate the tension is obviously by arguing that both of you are wrong.
Thanks, David. That's such a good idea.
Isn't it? That's how we unite people. Supply them with a common enemy.
Anyway, top secret here.
But also, what I'm going to say is true. There's, you brought us evidence, textual evidence. It is conclusive evidence, but it's conclusive evidence of what? It's conclusive evidence that the conspiracy theory kind of motive did play a role, at least with some significant political agents. It is not...
Just to say something maybe on this. I'm not saying that this is the only fact.
Okay, good. Just a second. And I think that Danny presented some arguments that make it very plausible that at least some bona fide motivations, not certainly not conspiratorial, motivations played a role as well. And both of you seem to generalize way too quickly. The thing to say about the political motivations behind these practices and legal doctrines in Israel is the same thing to say about the political motivations behind anything else, namely that it's a huge mess. And now we need to weave through the details and see that with some people and some institutions and sometimes in some decisions, this was the dominant motivation, and in others, the situation is much more complicated. It's not as if everything is wonderful. It's not as if everything is conspiratorial. And that's not something, that doesn't tell us anything special about multiculturalism or about Israel, because that's true of any political arrangement ever. Of course, we should be very careful about what follows from it, if anything at all, because Danny, for instance, he said at some point, I think, something like, something about the motivations, and then you said something about the interests, about Israel's interests, as if Israel doesn't have an interest in this divide and conquer kind of conspiracy. And that doesn't follow. So you ask, what more evidence than this? That's a good evidence for what we call an existential claim. There are such motivations, not for the universal claim that all of them are. I don't know that you need a universal claim. Your rhetoric sometimes suggests it. I don't know that you need the universal claim either, although your rhetoric sometimes suggests it. But that's the way I ended both of you.
I totally agree, David.
Good. See that, and you thought I wouldn't bring peace to you.
You should celebrate that.
I mean, the claim about control is in chapter 4, where I argue that being with it or under the jurisdictional authority of a religious court is not just being an innocent constellation. You have forces also pushing you to stay within. And one of these forces happens to be this intention, which I find and I discuss. And it's discussed not just out of the blue, it's discussed because there was this initiative to enact an ordinance where the Arabs would be part of the decision-making process as Arabs. And this ordinance was killed. So there were actual consequences for this attitude. And this is just a partial list of documents that I list. So it wasn't just, in some kind of, in mind, it had actual...
I'm not going to argue about the facts because, I don't...
I'm not making this up. That's
not fair. That was not.
I think we should give Danny an opportunity at some point to answer.
Danny, Then you can pick when. There is also, Jeff is also on the queue and Alon is also on the queue.
Can I be on the queue?
He's on the queue as well.
No worries. Shall I start?
Whenever you want. I mean, if you can also delay it till later.
No, it's clear that we have many disagreements. So, let's say something about multiculturalism in general regarding the Arab population in Israel. By the way, this is a kind of, I guess it's a marginal point, but if you can shed light on that, I would be happy. You use this expression Arab Palestinian again and again. I wasn't sure what's behind that because, you know, all Palestinians are Arab. I think that's almost by the definition. Not all Arabs are Palestinian. So it would be enough to say Palestinian, to be Israeli Palestinian. So, okay, but that's not very important. I mean, the first thing you teach in the first class on a course on multiculturalism is the difference between individual rights and group rights, right? So the novelty of multiculturalism is to say that we need to add to individual rights group rights.
No, it's individual rights expressed in group rights.
No worries, okay. But we have group rights.
That's
those who were against multiculturalism say, no, we don't do that. So think of Brian Berry as, you know, the paradigm example. He says, no, we have only individual rights. Don't talk to me about group rights. Okay, so that's Kilo Aleph B. Now, how do you express these group rights? In many ways, and they differ from one country to another. So you give them language rights and schools and all kinds of self-rule on the local level or religious level, and so all kinds of arrangements, okay? So a country which is kind of strictly liberal in the individualist sense with no multiculturalism would be a country where you don't have all of that. You don't have language rights, you don't have schools that teach in the minorities language and so on and so forth. So if somebody took a basic course on multiculturalism from Mars and you know, came to Israel, would be kind of surprised if he was told, or she was told, that Israel has absolutely no multiculturalism, you know, aspects. That would be very surprising.
Because about religion, the subtitle of the book.
Yeah, I understand. Right?
Okay.
So therefore, my claim, following, I don't need Ilan for that, but I think Ilan is right. And I happen to think that this is a strong basis for claims on behalf of the Palestinian minority in Israel for all kinds of rights. Because I buy into this multicultural stuff theory, I think that Palestinians in Israel have claims to the state, have claims to acknowledge their language, and various aspects of their culture. And all this brings the idea that also one of the things that the state is supposed to acknowledge, recognize in various ways, we can talk about these ways, is their religion. Okay? I mean, we find that everywhere in the world, and that would be natural. By the way, Jews also raise these claims. You find Haredi communities in Israel who think that as part of something like group rights or recognition, the state should recognize their school system, their courts, and so on. So the point with the analogy with free press, I guess wasn't very successful with you, was to say that even if you buy into the idea that the deep motivation underlying the adoption of a multicultural attitude policy towards Arabs in Israel was somewhat, in some sense, wrong, improper, impure, whatever, that doesn't change the fact that it is a multicultural policy. So, and that applies to all other rights as well. So to respect the right of free speech, you need not to impose constraints on speech. Now, if the reason you don't impose those constraints is just because there's this liberal woman you're dating and you want her to like you, that doesn't change the fact that what you're doing is respecting the freedom of speech.
No, that's wrong, Danny.
Okay, so
because
I disagree. So I think that the kind of the motivation doesn't change the fact that what you're doing is respecting that right, the right to free press or whatever. So if in Israel, Arabs can have schools and teach in Arabic, and Arabic has some kind of a status in Israel, and the long list, which isn't long enough in my view, it makes sense to say that Israel does have some kind of a multicultural policy towards its Palestinian minority. For me, it makes perfect sense to think that this policy should be applied to religious issues as well. And I would bet $1 million, Mikhail, that if tomorrow the Knesset abolished all these religious courts, we will be holding conferences
on the streets
here and other places, saying that Israel is again sacrificing its Arab minority for the sake of the Jewishness of the state. The Jews just can't live with the fact that there are other religions here, and so on and so forth. So, in a sense, so it's one thing to say that the actual conduct of some of these religious courts is unjust or discriminatory. That's one thing. It's a completely different thing to say that granting authority to these courts exclusive, yeah. Granting exclusive authority to these courts has nothing to do with multiculturalism. It might be a mistake. Again, this is, as you know, this is kind of a standard problem with multiculturalism. A standard, as we know, with Opaque. Okay. Now, Opaque doesn't say that when you grant authority to religious bodies, it isn't multiculturalism. She says it's bad for women. She might be right. But that's what she is.
Wait, I want to, Jeff, do you still have a comment to make? Later?
We can't.
You're on mute. Okay. So, later.
It can be now or later, whenever you want.
Oh, you didn't want to talk. So go on now.
Yeah, I was muted before. So, Michael, I don't want to concede anything from my ethics piece, actually. And so I just want to say this is, a different way to get at maybe the dispute between you and Donnie is, my argument there was if Islamic and Christian courts are going to have jurisdiction, there needs to be a role for the communities to play in picking who's in charge of these courts. In other words, there has to be either or both voice or exit, and preferably both. But you need to have, if it's going to be anything we want in a democracy, one or the other. I'll take one or the other. I prefer both. And so the argument in the ethics piece is we need to give them voice. And that I didn't want to make my comments about a dispute between you and I. You don't really say much about that proposal in the book manuscript. In the book. And so I am now bringing that up and defending that argument because Donnie's saying, well, maybe we should assume that these laws are okay. And I don't think that's right. But I think then there needs to be voice in the communities to determine who is going to interpret the laws, who's going to make the laws, so on and so forth. And I also prefer exit as well. So I'll just keep it at that. But I do want to bring that argument from the ethics piece into this conversation and press on you why you didn't make more of that, or why you don't think that's reasonable or a good idea, or maybe you do. That's all.
I think I speak a lot about the Greek Orthodox community, at least in the book itself. I have about 3 or 4 pages about how the Greek Orthodox community is organized by these Greek clergy that come from outside the community, and they happen to govern the community itself. for him to understand what was my argument about. And Danny is telling me this is multiculturalism. This is not multiculturalism. It might, as I said in the book, it might sound like a duck. It might walk like a duck and quake like a duck, but guess what? It's not. And this is exactly the case at hand here. How can you justify this order as being multicultural? And it's exclusive. You don't have an exit. Okay, but this is just one qualification. I speak of two other qualifications. One is about proportionality, and the other is about assimilation. Yeah, grant some recognition, but subsidize. Grant some recognition, recognize the marriage that happens in the religion. But how do you, from this liberal multicultural theory, justify, going all the way to exclusive jurisdiction? You can recognize, you can subsidize, you can grant representations. I give you a full list of, granting recognition to different religious groups, but you take the most extreme case and grant exclusive jurisdiction. This is also something which I happen to raise. And actually, you don't even discuss the first disqualification. Multiculturalism, and I stand to be corrected, Jeff, at least from Kim Licka and liberal multiculturalism's point of view, is that we fear that something would happen to the minority, and that's why we want to accommodate that minority. We want to strengthen, because otherwise it can't take care of its own giving the power structure. But Israel's identity as a Jewish state, Judaism as a religion, it's not endangering my religious identity as a Christian, as a Muslim. On the contrary, Judaism is built on making it hard on people to join in. So what are you protecting me from with this exclusive jurisdiction? What is the threat to my identity that you are protecting me from? And this is just another qualification that somehow, it's not discussed, but I think it's the most important. You don't have to grant this extra accommodation from a liberal point of view when it's not needed. You have to make a point. And this is what I'm saying. What's your point? How do you justify it?
Let's go to Alon and then to Raef. Yeah. And I suggest we'll collect both these comments and then you respond. Yes.
I want to concentrate on the main issue, namely the way we attribute tensions or motives to the state. And I want to disagree with some of the things that have been said here. Of course, I'm not familiar with the substance, and I'm not going to say anything about who is right here. I think that often we can say that state does something for the reason that X. And we often can say, okay, there were many motives, there is a dispute, there is evidence for this motive or that motive. But I think it's perfectly legitimate in many contexts to say, no. Yes, there are many people, they have different opinions, they acted for different reasons, and yet the state did this as a whole for the reason that X was a dominant reason. And I think that with respect to the debate between Danny and Michael, both of them say something like, yes, I'm sure both of them agree that, yeah, there is evidence here, there's evidence here, there's this person who said this, there's that person who said this. But both of them say, and I think it's a legitimate claim to say, even if there are these, different opinions, but it's perfectly legitimate to say this was a dominant reason because, for instance, it fits into, or it coheres with the general sentiment of the population. And this was a kind of the primary motive. So I think to say that, okay, Danny, yes, there is evidence here, there is evidence there, Michael, the same, is maybe the wrong thing to say. It may be the case that the dominant position is X, despite it. Now, with respect to some of the evidence provided by Michael, I think it's a little bit tainted by the fact that much of it, as was presented here, was in a way apologetic. It was public officials speaking about, I mean, not all of it, but some of it was apologetic. Namely, it was public officials trying to have a stand, to make a good argument, to make an argument that would sound legitimate. And perhaps this is so this is one reason to doubt some of the documents. But overall, the question of how we attribute intention to state is a big question, and I think that without addressing the methodological constraints or the methodology or how we do it, we cannot decide who is right and who is wrong.
Okay. Just a footnote. I can refer you to page 168. I mean, it's not.
Yeah, it's a great.
No, it's not my argument. it's a guy by the name of Raef Bauman. He wrote the article is here, and I quote. Maybe historian. The committee recommended that broad autonomy in religious matters be accorded to different religions. The policy of this ministry was already stated explicitly. Palmon became the advisor to the Prime Minister on Arab affairs in charge of the policy towards the Arabs. This divide and rule, he finds it in the documents, not just mine. This is him speaking of looking into the archives of the Mapai Party. This divide and rule formula was then adopted by the committee established in 1957 by the ruling party Mapai, in charge of advising on policies towards the Arab minority. It's not just these couple of arguments or it's history.
But Michael, I think that the archives shed really important light on motives from the early days. But even if we take all of that as 100% fact, I mean, all of us know that social institutions and legal institutions can change meanings and purposes over time. So some of the laws that were enacted when Israel was a young country are seen and interpreted differently now. And I mean, it's not necessarily related to what Raef said, but it is true that Israel is a movement in the sense that it keeps developing and evolving. People forget old truths and new ones are invented. So
that's fine.
But
it's not a conspiracy.
I think I agree that conspiracy is not a good word, but I want to just go back to the essence and to think about whether our political, democratic, legal concepts are a matter of absolutes or a matter of degree. And I think we all agree that they're a matter of degree.
And I've said this in the prefix. I've set the parameters for all of these terms. If you just read the prefix.
Okay, so Raef.
I said I agree with the basic argument of the book, which is timely and very important to make this intervention. Now, but I think also one need not sometimes overstate the argument, because the arguments stand even without any upgrading. And I want to make two comments in this regard. One, when we speak about multiculturalism as if there is one thing, but multiculturalism is many things. Multiculturalism, there are those who stress liberalism and adds some extra accommodation to the idea of difference. Some are ready to take difference into account, but are not ready to grant group rights. Some do grant group rights. In this sense, even liberalism itself, even without multiculturalism, the core idea of liberalism, it could be basically autonomy or choice or individualism. But there has been recent pushes, even without the rise of multiculturalism. Someone has to pay the price. And this is, in some way, taking difference seriously to the point that we don't want all to go with Levi's, drink Coca-Cola, and watch Netflix. One of the things as a student teaching in the US was that American students, is an American listening to us now? every student believes that he's unique in the same manner that others are. So everybody thought that he's doing something unique, but if you take what they think, that it's unique. If we don't want to get there, and we want to have different groups, some price needs to be paid, and the price probably is in the currency of autonomy. That some people would have less autonomy, less choice. Some people are constrained. This is a price to be paid for the fact that we're living in a pluralistic society. Now, one may say that I don't like that, I'm not ready to pay the price, but here there's an argument that there's a trade-off. Now, going back to the issue for the private liberal and the public illiberal, in many ways, this is very accentuated in the case of Israel, but this case is actually, it's built in, even in the liberal state. In what sense? Take the Yoder case in the US, the Yoder, the Wisconsin. The Yoder case, you can't imagine that in any public school in the US that they will allow something like that. But when it comes to the Amish, they are ready, in order to keep the Amish as a community, they are ready to pay some price, and they are aware that actually you are enslaved within that community. But if we want the community to survive, there's a certain price. Now, why is that in the public?
Because that community is threatened, right?
Not necessarily. I mean,
but probably that community, that's probably might be the case. But what I want to say is that
the only reason.
It is one of the main reasons.
That the public paradigm, it's not probably only the case, the public paradigm, because the religion of the majority has its manifestation already in the public sphere, and it's natural sort of to curtail it or to put restrictions on it because it's sort of invisible, because it's the background condition within which we're acting. And we have self-determination already for the majority. And the fact that you live in a majority, you're already constrained by the fact that of the state laws, that's in itself sort of an enslavement of the right of self-determination. So what I want to say that Israel in many ways is unique and not unique. It fits within a certain paradigm, but it's more radical. And that's to go back to the issue of degree. Yeah, it's many things are issues of degrees, but that's not a good defense many times. That means, and people think when they say, so that's what I wanted to say about this. Could be
books.
It's not empty. It seems like our connection, I think, is.
It's recurring, yeah.
Okay, so Danny, please.
No, just to clarify that.
Yeah, you can unmute yourself. It's not. Okay, Eyal, we wanted to let you have a word. Can you hear us? Okay. Do you still want to talk?
כן, שומעים אותי?
Yes.
Okay. So first, I want to thank everybody. It was fascinating. Although we at home couldn't hear everything you said, once in a while there were lapses in hearing you. Anyway, so we are already beyond time, so I'll just make a very short comment, hopefully not exposing my ignorance. Can there be an ill-motivated multiculturalism? If there can be an ill-motivated multiculturalism, then the differences of opinion is smaller than one might think, because partly it's a matter of definition, and I think that Danny's point is that there could be multiculturalism based on various good or bad reasons, but it would still be multiculturalism.
Danny, do you want to say more?
Yeah, just if I was misunderstood as supporting the exclusive jurisdiction of religious courts, then that's a mistake. Of course, I wasn't supporting them, and I have it in writing. Okay, I won't bother you with a long citation, but I have it in writing that I argued.
Nothing less than a specific page is good for this.
So
you can send us an email.
I mean, to write them, I support the establishment of a civil marriage system.
Is that here in the what you've written for this event, or somewhere else?
No.
He has time for a revision.
No, I'm just
somewhere else. I said I'm for civil marriage and divorce for all Israeli citizens, Jews and non-Jews alike. Okay, so let's just clear about it.
Okay, then I agree on that. I think I've had my day. Eyal, when we speak about multiculturalism, we usually speak about accommodations. So we call these accommodations, which entails that something is done in promoting this multicultural policy. It doesn't just come out of the blue. If it comes just out of the blue, I wouldn't be saying or would be regarding this as being accidentally multiculturalism. I'm not denying that maybe it can exist, but this is not the case I'm discussing here. And I don't know of such cases being discussed in the literature itself. So when we speak about accommodations, it does entail. As to what Raef said, it's the difference between what you imagine as right and what is claimed to be the case. And this is what I try to make out in the book. I'm not saying that it is truly liberal, okay? I'm even saying that it is illiberal in it when you truly, but this is the claim that is represented or presented to us. And if I disqualify it, then there is something else happening. You can believe it's multiculturalism and you don't get to the point I'm getting. But if you say it's not and it's something else, I'm trying to explain why this has happened. Now, you can take the discussion further and say that this might be even something bigger, which can be the case. And this is what I'm inviting actually the people to say. Of course, there's a trade-off. But this is the whole thing of when I speak about proportionality. There are a list of about 7 or 8. Jacob Levy gives a list of accommodations of well, there's representation, there are exemptions, there is subsidies, there is autonomy, there are external protections, internal restrictions. There's a whole list. So you can do something and there's a trade-off. But when you go to this extreme, the most thick accommodation of giving exclusive jurisdiction, and this is what I'm handling, right? Then it becomes suspicious. Why are you doing this? There is a trade-off. But if you're doing this is a trade-off, I think, that cannot be justified.
Everyone, this was fascinating. Left us with lots of food for thought. So I think now everybody will grab the. Thanks.